So far this semester, we've been talking a lot about culture. We started with talking about our own culture and the assumptions that we bring into a situation because of our cultural experiences. And then we've started looking at other cultures as well through your cultural lessons from your classmates, and also other readings as well. And so today I want to look at how culture can impact students' learning styles and other experiences that they have with you in the classroom. Specifically, I want you to be able to differentiate between high and low context cultures. And so if I give you a scenario of a behavior of a person, I want you to be able to tell me if that's a high context cultural trait or low. Also, you will look at other cultural characteristics or ways that we vary in our culture, looking at both verbal cultural communication and nonverbal, and also just the way we view the world and the importance that we put on different aspects of our human experience. We will also then be able to look at the three realms of the African American experience. I want you to really know those well. And then within those three realms, the 9 dimensions of Afroculturalism. And for those 9 dimensions, I really want you to memorize those because it's so important for you to start viewing the African American culture as a positive instead of all the stereotypes that we have listed in class. I want you, when you see an African American perhaps behaving in a way that's different than your own culture, for you to see the positive in it and not view it as a negative just because it's different than your own culture. With those 9 dimensions, I want you to be able to list them, to explain what they are, and then also thirdly, you will need to give examples of those 9 dimensions, or perhaps I may have you tell about how you will use those 9 dimensions, each of them, in your own classroom experience. Besides high and low context culture, which is hopefully very helpful to you in understanding how the way we are raised and the communities that we're in can influence our behaviors in the classroom, but there are some other basics to understanding cultural differences as well that we should go over. One is simple verbal communication, and so your students may have a different means of communicating, and we can break that down into about 4 ways. One is their use of grammar, which we have talked about with regards to Ebonics when your classmates presented their lesson. But even outside of Ebonics, we have variations of the use of standard English. So you have some students who do come from homes where there's not a lot of difference between their language that they speak at home versus what they're speaking in school. But then you have other students, whatever their race, that may have more variation of the way they're learning to speak at home, and then when they go into the classroom, that is not a cultural match to what is expected of them in the classroom. And what I would share as a strategy, and we talked a little bit about this in one of the sections with the student lessons, is kind of looking at this in a balance or a negotiation, in that I would encourage you to value the students, the way they speak at home, and you do that by allowing them to speak in that way in informal discussions when you're having a discussion about whatever the content is in your class, as long as they're also using the content vocabulary and the concepts that you're trying to encourage. But when it's time to write, if you give them, depending on the audience that they are writing for, talk to them about switching from standard or the way they speak at home or with their friends, which I call private language, to public language. So there are times as an English teacher where they were allowed to use private language in my class, definitely in discussions, but also in their journal writing. And then sometimes private language is better also when you're teaching, for example, creative writing. And so if my students were writing a short story, I wanted them to capture the authentic language of the characters. And so they were encouraged to draw on their knowledge of private language, or even in poetry as well for creative purposes. But if I had them writing to the principal of our high school, or the President of the United States, or their congressperson, or just writing a research paper in general, then they needed to switch from private language to public language. And so, again, that's a more neutral way of addressing, instead of saying academic language versus slang. Slang has a negative connotation, so if you could call it private language versus public, you're not giving any kind of judgment to their home language, while you're still trying to give them the tools that they need to be successful in middle-class America. Semantics can also be something that could be a challenge for a teacher. For example, and you see this as well, I'm sure, with just generationally, teenagers have their own kind of code and their own language to use. And so, for example, my student Marcus, that I talk a lot about because he's like a son to me, we were talking when he was a senior in high school, and I said something about him getting finished a big project, a senior project, which wasn't due until April, and this was about September, October, and he said, yeah, I'll be finishing it in a minute. And to me, in a minute means in a couple of minutes, within 10 minutes. But for him, in a minute means in the near future, maybe within the year. So semantics, his meaning of the phrase in a minute was very different than my own. And so I had to clarify that so that I understood, so that we could understand each other. Also within verbal communication, you may find that the sound or pitch or the rhythm of your students, their tempo in the way they speak could be different than your own, and that could present difficulties for you. I've had students who work over at George Junior in tutoring say that they really struggle to understand their students who are from urban settings. And a lot of times it's that that student talks softer and their words kind of flow together more, and so the tempo and the rhythm is different than the white middle class culture, and so that can be a challenge for teachers as well, that you just have to kind of adapt to and work through, ask them to either speak up or repeat themselves and so forth. But also it just takes some adapting for the teacher to learn to be able to hear and interpret those type of rhythms and tempos. And then we've talked a little bit about, too, the discussion mode, whether it's participatory and the listening patterns. How do you know that the person you're speaking with is listening? We've mentioned before that there are some cultures that, out of respect, they do not make eye contact. So while they're talking to you, they may be looking down. And whereas in our culture that is disrespectful, or at least we think that they're not paying attention to what we're saying. And I encountered that definitely in Houston, where it was kind of bothersome to me if a student was looking down. And then I had to take a step back and think, oh wait, this is their culture, so they don't mean any disrespect by it. They are actually showing me respect. So I had to kind of check myself there. And then discussion participation, students may interrupt while you're talking, and to them that is showing that they are listening to you, whereas we might find that offensive because you may be from a culture where you let the person speak their piece and then you take turns talking. So it just depends, and that's not just a certain race or culture, but it varies a lot throughout American culture. Different subcultures have more of a participatory discussion mode. For example, I'm Italian, and so when we are together, my family, you can see that we're always talking over each other. And that can affect also volume, because we may talk a little louder and get louder, because when you're the youngest of 5 or the youngest of 8, you have to be loud to be heard, and you have to interrupt to be heard. So that too can have an influence in your relationships with your students. If you can, go ahead and click on the 2 examples that I have in hyperlinks here. So the verbal communication, and then the tempo, word tempo. The word tempo example is a man in Appalachia, and just notice the difference in tempo of the way he speaks versus the way you speak. And what would be some of the challenges for that in your classroom if a student had that same speech pattern that he has? Also, with communication, body language can have an impact, as well as some other nonverbals. If you click on the hyperlink to body language, I think this little highlight is about maybe 10 minutes, if I recall. And you can kind of scroll through it a little bit, but I thought it was interesting. I was really trying to find an example for you of Asian Indian people, and it comes towards the end of that show that you'll be watching. But for me, when I was teaching a lot of Asian Indian students in Tennessee, it was a struggle for me when I would talk with parents, because they would nod their head would go from shoulder to shoulder. And in our culture, we don't do that exact movement, but if we're shaking our head, like our chin's going from shoulder to shoulder, that means no. However, if we're nodding our head, it could mean yes, or it could mean I get what you're saying. And so it took me a while to understand the communication through the head going from side to side, the ear going down to shoulder in the Indian culture. And it's basically, my understanding is, it's pretty similar to our nodding our head. It doesn't necessarily mean, it doesn't mean no. It means I understand what you're saying. So that is something, again, that when you're communicating with families and students, asking questions about that so that you don't have a misunderstanding will help you to learn their culture much quicker, so that you can have better communication with them. And also, I think they will appreciate that you want to know more about their culture. Personal space is definitely cultural as well, and I found as a teacher that I kind of struggled with that, because I get a little bit claustrophobic, Even in my culturally relevant pedagogy class, if we're all gathered together at the board or something to that effect, sometimes I can feel my breathing is increasing in rate. And that's just a personal issue of mine. And so I've had to tell students, I'm sorry, but I need a little more personal space, and I kind of draw an imaginary box around myself that's just about 2 feet back to say, could you please just honor this space? I need this much space to speak with you. But again, it's important that I've already established a positive rapport with that student so that he or she is not offended, and so that they understand it's just cultural for me. But it's okay, I think, if that's something that you need, to go ahead and share that with your students, because you will have some that are just right there at your toe-to-toe with you. And then also just the how they touch, the frequency and location of touch. We had a new faculty member at the beginning of the school year who is African American, and the wife, I introduced myself to them and was having a nice conversation, and the wife came up, and I didn't know her at all, and she kept rubbing my back in circles, and that was just really kind of different for me. Because to me, like, we didn't know each other well enough for her to be rubbing my back, but that was cultural. And so I found when I was working in Houston, I did use much more touch with my students, but you have to be very careful with how you do that. So let me just give you a couple guidelines very quickly while we're on the topic. One is I would never, ever, ever touch a student if it was out of discipline, like that I was redirecting them, because that can be seen as a form of aggression. So if I were trying to tell a student that they need to sit down, I would not touch them while telling them to sit down. I would ask them politely to please sit down. So a lot of times my use of touch with students was out of encouragement and support, and so I might touch their arm. If I was telling them they did a great job, or I know you can do this, I might touch their back. And that was about it. You will have students that come and want to give you a hug. If they are approaching you for the hug, then that to me is okay. But you shouldn't ask students for hugs. I think you have to be careful with that, because again, culturally speaking, some cultures touching is a normal part of their everyday exchange, whereas other cultures are much more inward with their expectation of touch. They don't want to be touched. So you have, and students within a culture too have variation as well. So you just get to know your students well enough to know if they are a student who appreciates that or is uncomfortable by that. And then, of course, nonverbal communication can be through signs and symbols, clothing, jewelry, etc., can show a student's connection to their culture. One thing that, just a side note, that was interesting to me in my time in Houston was my high school where I taught required the young men to be clean-shaven. And in fact, my students would tell me that when they come into school, if they were not clean shaven, they would be escorted to the restroom with a cheap razor and be required to shave. And this probably, like, I wouldn't suggest that you do this, but I told the students that that's actually against their rights. Students have a right to facial hair because it can be a religious statement. It's a part of their religion or culture. And if you are having them shave, you're making them make a permanent change. Whereas a t-shirt that's offensive, you can require a student to take that and change it, because they can always put that t-shirt on at the end of the day. Whereas they cannot require you to make permanent alterations or semi-permanent alterations to your appearance, especially in light of it perhaps being cultural or religious. So that's just a side note. I didn't get in trouble for telling the students that, but perhaps I could have, I don't know. But also, like signs, symbols, flags, that flags were an issue in Tennessee because of their pride in the Confederacy. And so some of my African American students would tell me that they were offended by these flags, that students would either wear on their shirts or on their trucks and things like that, because to them it was a sign of being in favor of slavery versus being proud of their Southern heritage. So that can cause issues as well that maybe need to be addressed in the school community or in your classroom as well. So far we've talked about cultural differences that we can pretty much see or hear among our students, but some of the harder ones for us to differentiate are more of the social values that differ from culture to culture. And one thing that I think that we really struggle with in America is recognizing, like, we're pretty good at recognizing that immigrants have a distinct culture that they come to us with, but we don't necessarily recognize the culture of poverty, and we don't recognize subcultures within our own nationality. We don't recognize the African American group as having their own culture. And so that's why we've been spending a lot of time unpacking the African American experience this semester, and also we'll delve into that more deeply in this lecture as well. We have just not done a good job of recognizing their culture, or we just focus on what we perceive as negatives in their culture. And so we'll take a look at that today. But also we're dealing a lot with African American culture because even though they have been, their people may have been on this continent longer than your own families, they still are facing inequality. And so it's something that we have to deal with. Anyway, I'm a little bit off track here, but looking at some of the social values for our students from other cultural experiences, these again are things that we can't necessarily see, but our students may come from families that have a differing view on how people should behave. And so, of course, that's going to impact their school experience because we, again, tend to operate our schools from a white middle class culture, and so that we have our own ideas of how students should behave. And also even what we consider to be beautiful, what is something that we, like, how do we view, what our goals are, for example. And what do we believe about showing kindness? How are you kind to someone? That can vary. How do we share loyalty, or even, like, do we consider loyalty a priority? Again, I would say that lower context cultures may value loyalty a little less because those relationships aren't as deep from a lack of time as they are in a higher context culture. So loyalty can definitely play out in your classroom, where you may have students who have a very deep loyalty to others in the classroom, or a very deep loyalty to their family. And so that can then impact what happens in your classroom, as far as if you were having trouble with one student and they have a strong loyalty among others in the classroom, then a lot of times the teacher will have to really work with that one student to bridge any differences, so that they can then have the respect of more students in the classroom. And so that's an interesting dynamic as well. How do you show respect? That for me was a great learning experience in Houston. For me, coming from Grove City College and then also teaching in a boarding school before I came down to teach in Houston, I was able to just demand respect from my students at the boarding school. It was a military-based boarding school, so I could just require it, and the students would give me their respect. Whereas in Houston, I learned very quickly that I couldn't just command respect. I had to earn respect from the students. And so it almost flips itself. Whereas I would I would learn to respect my students for how well they were attending to things, their accomplishments in class, in the boarding school setting. Instead, in Houston, you have to give them respect right away. You have to respect them immediately, whether they, quote, deserve it or not. But yet, I have to earn respect for them. So it's almost turned on its head. And so, again, with that loyalty, too, kind of the two overlap in that the students in a more urban setting have a very strong sense of self-respect. And so if you, as a teacher, especially a white teacher, redirect them in an assertive way in front of their peers, you have disrespected them, you have offended their sense of self-respect, and so they are going to, the situation will escalate, they will become more aggressive to you because you have offended that respect in front of their friends and so forth, even if they were being disrespectful to you to begin with. So instead, what I found in Houston that was helpful for me is to empathize with them first and then ask them to redirect their behavior. So, for example, if I had a student who was chatting with their neighbor while I was trying to give instruction to the class, I might walk up to the student and say, I know that you guys don't have a lot of time to talk to each other during the school day, but if you could please listen to me right now, and then you'll have time to talk after class. So I'm not saying be quiet, I'm not saying shut up, I'm not in their face. And so then if they talk back to me, they look like the jerk because the whole class saw that I was being respectful to them, that I was empathizing. I get that you guys should have more time socially to just chat, but I need to do my job here, so please listen, or just give me this amount of time. So that was a change that I had to make in the way I related to my students. And this also happened recently with a student teacher at George Junior Republic. The student complained at the end of class in a very respectful way. He was not disrespectful at all, but he came and said to her, I don't feel like you're respecting us when you tell us to do something or you're going to give us a consequence. We know what the consequences are, but you need to respect us and talk in a respectful tone. So he, again, this young man, probably from Philadelphia, had a very strong sense of his own sense of respect. And so for him, the teacher talking to him like a young adult was important. And he would be fine in responding to her as long as she did that and did not make him feel like she was ordering him around. Also, something else that we have to think about is what our standards are for privacy. And some cultures have a stronger sense of privacy, whereas others don't, and it just varies on different topics. For example, I've noticed with friends from China that they're more ready and feel very open to talk about money, whereas in the white middle class, you don't really, you talk in vague terms about money. So, for example, when we were buying a house, since we've moved here in Grove City, I had a friend from China ask me how much we were paying for it. And no one else would ever, none of my white middle class friends asked me how much we were paying for the house. They could look it up, they would do it secretly if they were interested, but they would never just confront me and say, how much are you paying for that house? And so I think the white middle class has a little more privacy in terms of finance. And then others may have privacy as far as you have to know the person well to even ask them about specific things going on in their lives. So again, we have to be careful with that with our students as well. And so for me, it's been helpful to respond to the student's lead. So if they are sharing with me something from outside of the school day, then I know that that student's comfortable with sharing that amount of their personal lives with me. But I wouldn't just ask them poignantly about a boyfriend or about their work and things until they have shared a little bit of that for me.
So if you ever have that question of what is their kind of their fence as far as their sense of privacy and what they want to keep to themselves, just pay attention to their own cues that they're giving you, and let them take the lead